Hello, I'm Regina Botras, and this is Backstage, where we talk with the who's who on stage, in dance, comedy and performing arts, speaking with the leading theatre makers of our times and how they came to the stage and what drives them and inspires them. I am joined by the Artistic Director of Sydney Chamber Opera, Jack Symonds, to talk about Gilgamesh, which is on at the Carriage Works, a collaboration, a co-production between Opera Australia, Sydney Chamber Opera and Carriage Works, uniting for the first time. Let's welcome Jack Symonds to the show.
Thanks for having me, Regina.
Thanks for coming on. So this seems like a perfect kind of story to bring to the chamber opera. Well, to opera, I suppose, because it's so epic in classical terms, but Sydney Chamber Opera is kind of looks generally more at new works as far as I understand. Like, how did this story, let's start with how the story came about in the first place.
Sure. Well, yeah, Sydney Chamber Opera, we specialise in the production of brand new work, and this is a brand new work, even the story itself is old. I feel that there's so much to be found in the idea of reinterpreting some of the older stories with the theatrical and musical language of our times. I mean, that's what opera always has done. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself is the oldest written poem that we have in civilization, and it was essentially lost until the 19th century. And I'm sure that had the Renaissance inventors of modern opera had the Epic of Gilgamesh as a story, they definitely would have said it as one of those kind of myths that began opera, because that's what opera was. It was taking the fundamental stories of civilization in the Renaissance and those composers and writers and theatre makers remade those stories with the musical and theatrical language of their times. And that's what we're doing today. It's what opera always has done well. It's just the language is what changes. The concerns of the times change, the mechanism of theatre and the grammar of music and the method of vocal, instrumental, and now electronic production, all of these things are what evolve, but the concerns of what the combination of music and text, stage action and design can achieve altogether really has been a constant over the last half a millennium. And that's kind of amazing that this art form has been able to continually reinvent itself. And I view Sydney Chamber Opera as we're reinventors. We're reinventors primarily. And whether or not the story is something that's totally topical and could have been only written last year, whether the story is the oldest written one in civilization, it's the language and the mechanism of theatre and music that can be most fruitfully adapted and shown to new audiences to essentially give them something they've never heard or seen before.
Yeah, it's just incredible. It feels like it's a natural fit, really. And I was surprised to hear it hadn't been done, which is kind of funny. So it's the librettist is Lewis Garrick, a previous artistic director at one point for Sydney Chamber Opera. What is the story of these old, Mesopotamian times poems?
Yeah, look, the 1 minute potted version, there's
Yes.
there's a despotic totalitarian king, that's Gilgamesh. The gods have decided that this isn't a very good idea for society to have a totalitarian despot in charge, and they create a half man, half beast called Enkidu. They make him out of clay, and they set him up to challenge Gilgamesh to curb his power in the absence of any kind of democracy or any idea of those. It's like the idea of creating another equally strong being to topple this despotic king was the solution found. And through various machinations they meet, Enkidu is tamed to become more human-like, but instead the big thing that happens is instead of becoming rivals, they upon fighting they become friends, and arguably, and very much in this interpretation, they become lovers. It's a pretty unavoidable part of the epic that in almost every translation, um, there's the line that Gilgamesh loves Enkidu like a wife, which is kind of archaic language now, but it's very clear that that's what that 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 is the relationship, and so the idea of love between the two of them begins to transform Gilgamesh and does indeed make him into a more sensitive kind of character. But the problem is they team up, they cut down the forest, they kill the forest guardian, and all of this angers the goddess Ishtar, who decides to wreak vengeance upon this, and Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh learns what death is and spends the rest of the time trying to understand the meaning of mortality and death, and there is no clear answer. He tries to find an eternal human who survived the Great Flood, who essentially tells him there is no answer to life and death. And so it's extraordinary to me that the three prongs of this most ancient story are um, environmentalism, they are existentialism, and the kind of power of love, and especially in a same sex love relationship. They are the three main prongs about this story that seems to have echoed down the ages to become something that is quite foundational. So they are the three approaches and three big narrative strands that we've brought out in this interpretation. Um, and it's amazing how it fits both the performers and the way that we think and feel about these things today quite naturally.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you, I mean, I know that you are not the librettist, you are writing the music with Lewis. And I read some incredible, there's a lot of material online that you can kind of look at what he's written in his adaptation. And I love that idea of the sun was a god that disappeared at night. So some of these things, and you just mentioned the climate and the protector of the trees. I love that kind of old world thinking. But I was going to ask, yeah, did you research or with your collaboration, I suppose, research current people? It was the first idea, despots in our times and climate and things like that. Are there things that you're pulling from contemporary views?
Yeah, well, I think we are people that live now, and we see we see the climate and we see totalitarianism every day in our lives. I mean, it's not as interesting for us to make these things explicit and tie it to 2024. I think some of the power of um, this myth is the fact, and this story is the fact that it's very obvious that these things have always been concerns of humanity. And so, sure, I mean, in as much as we exist today and these things are uppermost in our minds, but in a way, lots of the research has been about looking at the ways that various translators have, from the 19th century when it was first translated into English, and the clay tablets were refound in the 19th century. The way that translators of the last century and a half and more have even in this amount of time have retranslated and re-emphasized things for their own times. Um, the kind of environmental message and definitely the queer aspect were extremely downplayed at the beginning in the 19th century because that wasn't really what people cared about then. Um, and it was certainly not what was able to be written about in many ways. And so being able to take advantage of contemporary translations and see how those things that strongly echo with our own, with the concerns of our own society, are something that a translation, an adaptation, and a theatrical expression can make manifest.
So you being the composer, musical composer, um, you mentioned earlier about the grammar of music. How does that work? Like, what is the grammar of music? And then how is that applied to the characters in this story?
That's an excellent question, a very, very large question. No, 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 no. The short answer is that I'm very interested in, and I wrote for very specific people in this specific singers in this opera. And what has been interesting to me is the to create the continuum from human to fantastical, from human animal, um, to create this large spectrum that the characterization of the epic needs and necessitates, and to use the tools of music that we have now to do that. Specifically, things such as using electronics alongside a voice to take it into, I suppose, superhuman or non-human places. The beginning of the characterization of the half man, half animal Enkidu begins essentially with the most elemental breathing sounds as pre-singing, pre-vocalization, but these are synthesized quite complexly with the electronics that emanate from the orchestral instruments, and it becomes as if it's kind of a human instrumental hybrid that neither could make without the advancement of live electronics. And likewise, Ishtar, the goddess that we need to understand, is above humanity. The idea that one can take the live performance of a voice and treat it and filter it to create a kind of infinite expression and an infinite length and halo uh, around the words and the pitches to create something that again couldn't be just done live. And so the grammar of music extends out from those ideas of what are the specific, very like hyper specific, very local events needed to be represented in the music and in the story, and how can I use every resource that I have available to make something that could only be made in this way. And I find that the most interesting way of making, and the most satisfying way of making an opera today. Rather than thinking of it as a one size fits all form that like you have an orchestra and you have a variety of soloists, you have a chorus, and you have to retrofit the story to that. Here, I've thought about what what specific colors and sounds will I need to represent this specific moment, and built out from there, writing for very specific players and singers, which I find the most satisfying thing as a composer. And I'm amazingly privileged to be able to have a cast of like Australia's best new music singers, as well as the collaboration with the Australian String Quartet and Ensemble Offspring, who are the leading exponents of this kind of playing as well. Both of whom have played my music before and have come together as a kind of super group of instrumentalists to realize this vast score with all the experience they have, all the things I've asked them to do over the years.
It sounds perfect as a cross sort of platformer. That's not the right word, but in the musical space, does that mean, because often, you do have the live musicians, do you have someone playing the live breathing? I imagine like some of it is kind of recorded, like you say, electronically. So there's an electronic element.
Actually, there is two electronic musicians, but my interest is in live electronics, which is in creating programs that take the live performance and transform it in real time. Um, for me personally, I often find that pre-recorded music is a bit of a prison for the performers because they can only exist, especially on a stage work. It's very different in concert when there's another element taken out. But when the performers are very physical and need to embody things, pre-recording music and having them fit into it does limit them. Even though, of course, the smallest differences, by the time you've rehearsing for weeks and months, it's down to the smallest micro time differences between performances. But it's having that knowledge that they and the instruments in the theatre generate all of the material, and it's the electronic music designer's job to create the programs that will transform it live according to the specificities of the score. So I find that a much more interesting space to work in. It's a much more complex and laborious space to work in, but for the performers that are used to um, performing all this stuff live and being very active on stage, it's a much more satisfying and musically enriching and theatrically enriching way of working.
Yeah, it's very much more active and real time rather than pre-recorded time.
Yes.
Also, I was wondering, this cross-platform. I don't like that's not the right way. What would you say for electronic versus classical music? Is it cross-platform
Well, I think it's
genres?
not. No, I think it's one thing. I mean, like electronics are part of how music has evolved in every genre. Um, it's not that it's cross anything. I mean, I don't see a distinction between um, the the way that one writes extremely specifically for a string quartet and the way that one then programs how that will be diffused in space. That's one continuum to me. And the more that those things are integrated, the better, I think. So it's not a it's not sort of a it's not a confectionery layer on the top. It's a
No.
fundamental way of imagining how an ensemble sounds together.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, it's certainly not that there's yeah that it's I prefer to think of it as transformations. I mean, instruments. The Australian String Quartet, they all play a matching set of 17th century instruments. Um, and the 17th century instruments, the technology of them is perfect for a string quartet, and has been since the 17th century. Um, but I view electronics there as just being another color on top of it. I mean, there are many ways that these players play their instruments now that wouldn't have been conceived in the 17th century. And now electronics can take those sounds and can process them and treat them in a continuum um, that is just an outgrowth of the natural sound of this total historical genre.
Mm. Well, I was trying to think of the kind of parallels because this sort of really old story today and like you say 17th century musical instruments with this current mix that we were talking about. But also when I was reading online, there's the visual uh, imagery of Gilgamesh with the lion and the transformative, half man, half animal. And I wondered how that was all transforming visually on the stage. Does it have this play with old and new as well?
Absolutely, I think for many listeners, are we familiar with the work of Kip Williams, who is the director of this show and also the artistic director of Sydney Theatre Company, and of course has made the world famous picture of Dorian Gray. Um, and Kip is very interested in, and the designers Elizabeth Gadsby and David Fleischer are very interested in the the continuum as well between, I guess, iconic images of the Epic of Gilgamesh, like as you say, the lion skin, or or the scorpions, and the transformation from animal to human, and incorporating those into costumes and a visual language that matches the way the music commutes between the ancient and the modern. And so, yes, this is a piece full of visual transformation. Um, this is a piece where lighting and costume and the performers' bodies become the major canvas upon which this epic is written in many ways. The detail with which the body is transformed, um, with uh, both with organic materials and with inorganic costume materials, and with and in space, becomes the way that we view, I guess, the essential humanity of these characters as portrayed by these five humans on stage, but still suggests the idea of a kind of infinitely expanding epic. So yeah, so anyone familiar with Kip's work, there isn't hint there. There's no film in this. There's no. This is not one of his film works. This is one of, I guess, straight theatre in an opera. But the the transformation processes that he's so famous for in his film work have left an indelible mark upon his non-film work, I believe. And there's a lot of that in this opera, and it's a visual feast.
Yeah, in the carriage works, which is an epic space to fill, and it sounds like the perfect space for this work. Jack, thank you so much. It sounds so exciting. I can't wait. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Regina.